Alex Carter had always been a man of simple pleasures. He didn't need much, just his cozy little house by the lake, his morning coffee on the porch, and the quiet hum of nature around him. For over 2 decades, he'd lived in this small lakeside community, tucked away from the chaos of city life. It was peaceful here, almost like time moved slower. People knew each other's names, waved when they passed on the road, and shared stories at the local diner. It felt like home. At the heart of this tranquil setting was the lake, a shimmering expanse of water that stretched across acres of land. The lake wasn't just beautiful. It was practical too. Families spent weekends fishing along its banks. Kids paddled canoes during summer breaks, and neighbors often gathered for picnics under the shade of towering oak trees nearby. But what made the lake truly special was the old wooden bridge that spanned its width. That bridge meant more to Alex than most people realized. Decades ago, when he first moved into the area, there was no proper way to cross the lake unless you had a boat. So, using his engineering skills and sheer determination, Alex built the bridge himself. It wasn't fancy. It was sturdy, reliable, and functional. Over the years, it became a lifeline for many residents. Some used it to reach their homes on the opposite side of the lake, while others simply enjoyed walking across it to take in the view. To Alex, it wasn't just a structure. It was a piece of his legacy. Life went on like this for years, calm, predictable, and happy. That is, until the Homeowners Association, HOA, decided to shake things up. The HOA had always existed in the background, mostly handling minor issues like maintaining streetlights or organizing annual cleanup drives. But lately, they'd grown bolder. Under the leadership of their new president, a sharp-tongued woman with expensive suits and an even sharper attitude, they started pushing for improvements all over the neighborhood. They widened roads, replaced old benches in the park, and added flashy signs welcoming visitors to the area. Most people thought these changes were harmless enough, maybe even nice. But Alex wasn't so sure. Then came the day that changed everything. One crisp autumn morning, Alex woke up to find something missing. At first, he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Everything seemed normal. The sun was rising over the horizon. Birds chirped in the distance, and the air smelled fresh after last night's rain. But as he stepped outside onto his porch, cup of coffee in hand, he froze. The bridge was gone. Not damaged, not broken. Completely demolished. In its place was nothing but splintered wood and twisted metal scattered across the muddy shoreline. Someone had torn it down overnight, leaving behind only scraps of what once stood proudly above the water. Alex's heart sank. He rushed down to the scene, his mind racing with questions. Who would do such a thing? Why hadn't anyone warned him? It didn't take long to get answers. Later that afternoon, Alex attended an emergency HOA meeting called specifically to discuss the lake renovations. As he walked into the cramped community center, he noticed several familiar faces looking uneasy. Clearly, he wasn't the only one blindsided by this sudden change. When the meeting began, the HOA president took charge immediately. With a confident smile, she announced that the old bridge had been removed because it was outdated and posed a safety risk. She went on to explain how they planned to replace it with a modern concrete structure that would better suit the growing needs of the community. According to her, this decision was final, and construction would begin within weeks. Alex couldn't believe what he was hearing. Outdated? Safety risk? Those claims were laughable. He had personally inspected the bridge just a few months earlier and found it perfectly sound. Sure, it wasn't shiny or high-tech, but it worked. More importantly, it belonged to the community, not some faceless organization bent on making everything look sleek and polished. When the floor opened for discussion, Alex raised his hand. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, but his words carried weight. "That bridge wasn't just some random structure," he said firmly. "I built it myself 20 years ago. It connected families, helped people get where they needed to go, and brought us closer together. You didn't even ask us before tearing it down. Did you think we wouldn't care?" The room fell silent. For a moment, it seemed like his words might sink in. Then the HOA president leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "Progress isn't always easy," she replied coolly. "Sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the greater good. We're improving the neighborhood, not preserving relics." Her tone stung. Relics? Was that what she thought of something Alex had poured his heart and soul into creating? Something that had served the community faithfully for years? He clenched his fists but forced himself to stay calm. Arguing further wouldn't change anything, not right now. Anyway, as the meeting dragged on, Alex realized something else. The HOA wasn't done yet. Their plans extended far beyond replacing the bridge. They wanted to transform the entire lakeside area, adding luxury amenities and high-end facilities to attract wealthier residents. One project in particular caught Alex's attention, a sprawling $4 million resort set to be built on the far side of the lake. It sounded extravagant, unnecessary, and completely out of place in this quiet corner of the world. By the time the meeting ended, Alex's head was spinning. He drove home in silence, staring out at the empty space where the bridge used to be. Anger bubbled inside him, but beneath that anger lay something deeper, a desire to fight back. If the HOA thought they could steamroll over him and the rest of the community, they were wrong. Little did Alex know his battle was only beginning. And soon, the lake itself would become the stage for his ultimate act of defiance. The days following the HOA meeting felt heavy for Alex. Every time he looked out at the lake, all he could see was the gaping hole where the bridge used to stand. It wasn't just about losing something he had built with his own hands. It was deeper than that. The bridge represented connection, not just between two sides of the lake, but among the people who lived there. Without it, the community felt fractured, like a puzzle missing its central piece. But anger alone wouldn't fix anything. Sitting around stewing over what happened wasn't going to bring the bridge back or undo the damage caused by the HOA's bulldozers. Alex knew he needed to channel his frustration into action. But what could one man do against an organization with resources, influence, and seemingly no regard for anyone else's opinion? That question gnawed at him as he spent long hours pacing in his workshop, sipping cold coffee and staring blankly at old tools hanging on the walls. One evening, while sorting through some boxes in the attic, Alex stumbled upon something that stopped him in his tracks. Buried beneath stacks of yellowed papers and forgotten mementos were blueprints, detailed drawings of the lake and its surrounding structures. He remembered creating them years ago when he first designed the bridge. Back then, he'd been meticulous, documenting every aspect of the project, from measurements to materials. These weren't just plans for the bridge, though they included schematics of the dam that held the lake's water in place. Curiosity got the better of him, and Alex spread the blueprints across his kitchen table. As he traced the lines with his finger, one detail caught his eye: manual release valves embedded in the base of the dam. He vaguely recalled installing them decades earlier as part of emergency flood prevention measures. If the lake ever threatened to overflow during heavy rains, these valves could be opened to slowly drain the excess water. At the time, it seemed like a smart precaution, a safeguard against disaster. But here's the thing nobody talked about those valves anymore. Over the years, newer generations had taken over maintenance of the dam, and it seemed like knowledge of the manual controls had faded into obscurity. Modern technology had replaced human oversight with automated systems, regulating water levels instead. Most people probably didn't even know the old mechanisms existed, let alone how they worked out. An idea began to form in Alex's mind, an idea so bold it almost scared him. What if he could use those forgotten valves to take control of the situation? Not violently, not recklessly, but strategically. After all, the HOA had shown zero respect for the community's history or values. They demolished the bridge without a second thought, dismissing it as irrelevant. Why shouldn't Alex remind them just how important the lake and everything connected to it really was? His thoughts turned darker as he considered the HOA's grand plans for the area. Their shiny new resort loomed large in his mind. From what he'd heard at the meeting, it was supposed to be a luxury destination complete with private docks, cabanas, and panoramic views of the lake. A $4 million investment, they'd boasted, designed to attract affluent tourists and boost property values in the neighborhood. To Alex, it sounded less like progress and more like greed wrapped in designer packaging. And then it hit him, the perfect way to make them pay attention. If the lake dried up, the resort would lose its main selling point. No sparkling water, no picturesque scenery, no reason for anyone to visit. The thought made Alex smile for the first time in days. It was risky, sure, but also strangely poetic. The HOA had destroyed something meaningful to him. Now he could show them what it felt like to have something precious taken away. Still, Alex knew he couldn't rush into this. He needed to think carefully, plan meticulously, and avoid drawing suspicion. For starters, he had to confirm whether the manual valves still worked after all these years. If they were rusted shut or damaged beyond repair, his whole scheme would fall apart before it even began. The next few nights, Alex ventured out to the dam under the cover of darkness. Armed with a flashlight, gloves, and a toolbox, he crept along the narrow path leading to the structure. The dam was located far enough from residential areas that he rarely encountered anyone, but he stayed cautious anyway. He moved quietly, listening for any sounds that might indicate someone was nearby. Once satisfied he was alone, he knelt down and examined the valves. They were exactly where the blueprint said they'd be, hidden beneath metal panels bolted securely to the concrete wall. Using a wrench, Alex carefully loosened the bolts and pried open the panel. Inside, he found the mechanisms intact, though covered in a thin layer of grime. He wiped them clean and tested each valve, turning them slowly to ensure they responded smoothly. To his relief, they did. Decades of disuse hadn't rendered them useless after all. As he worked, Alex allowed himself to imagine the impact his actions would have. Picture it, the lake gradually shrinking, exposing muddy banks and leaving boats stranded high and dry. The once pristine shoreline transformed into a barren wasteland. And the resort? Instead of luxury suites overlooking crystal-clear waters, guests would find themselves staring at cracked earth and stagnant puddles. The HOA's dream project would become a laughingstock, but Alex also knew timing was crucial. If the water level dropped too quickly, it would raise alarms immediately. People would investigate, and it wouldn't take long for someone to trace the cause back to the dam. No, he needed to play the long game. Slow and steady wins the race, as the saying goes. By releasing small amounts of water over several days, or even weeks, he could create the illusion of a natural phenomenon, like an unusually dry season or a leak in the dam itself. With his plan solidified, Alex returned home each night, his mind buzzing with possibilities. On the surface, he acted normal, attending community events and chatting casually with neighbors. Nobody suspected a thing. How could they? To everyone else, he was just another resident frustrated by the HOA's decisions. They had no idea the wheels of revenge were already in motion. In the days that followed, Alex continued tinkering with the valves, adjusting them incrementally to let water flow out at a controlled pace. Each visit to the dam brought him closer to his goal, and with each turn of the wrench, he felt a little more in control. The HOA thought they held all the power, but soon they'd learn otherwise. What Alex didn't anticipate, however, was how deeply personal this fight would become. With every drop of water that drained from the lake, he felt a mix of satisfaction and sorrow. This wasn't just about teaching the HOA a lesson. It was about protecting the soul of the community he loved. The lake wasn't theirs to exploit. It belonged to everyone who called this place home. Little did Alex know, his quiet rebellion was about to unleash chaos far greater than he imagined. As the days turned into weeks, Alex's plan unfolded with precision. He'd become a creature of habit, slipping out of his house late at night when the world was still and quiet, armed with nothing more than his flashlight, a pair of gloves, and an old wrench from his toolbox. He made his way to the dam like clockwork. Each visit brought him closer to his goal, though it wasn't without its challenges. The first few nights were nerve-wracking. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, even the crunch of gravel beneath his boots, felt like a spotlight shining directly on him. He half expected someone to jump out from the shadows and demand to know what he was doing there. But as time went on, he grew bolder. The routine became almost comforting, a strange kind of therapy for the anger and frustration that had been simmering inside him since the bridge was destroyed. Each time he adjusted the valves, he reminded himself why he was doing this. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. Justice for the bridge, for the community, and for the lake itself. The HOA had acted like they owned everything, bulldozing over people's feelings and disregarding the history that tied them all together. They thought progress meant tearing things down and replacing them with something shinier, but Alex knew better. Real progress came from respecting what already existed, not erasing it. Still, Alex couldn't deny the thrill that coursed through him every time he turned the valve just a little bit more. He imagined the water slowly trickling out of the lake, inch by inch, until the once mighty body of water began to shrink. It was subtle enough that no one noticed right away. At first, people might think it was just a dry spell or some weird weather pattern. By the time they realized what was really happening, it would be too late. During the day, Alex played the part of a concerned neighbor perfectly. He attended HOA meetings, listened patiently to updates about the new resort, and nodded along when others expressed excitement about the upgrades coming to the area. Inside, he was seething, but he kept his emotions in check. If anything, he leaned into the role of the mild-mannered retiree who cared deeply about the community. No one suspected a thing. In fact, if anything, Alex's behavior seemed to throw the HOA off his scent entirely. One afternoon, while chatting with a group of neighbors at the local coffee shop, he casually mentioned how strange it was that the water level in the lake seemed lower than usual. A few heads turned, curious expressions crossing their faces. Someone joked about global warming, while another shrugged it off as normal seasonal changes. Alex nodded thoughtfully, adding fuel to the fire by saying, "Maybe we should look into it, just to be safe." That comment planted a seed of doubt in people's minds. Over the next few days, conversations around town shifted slightly. Residents started noticing the receding shoreline, the exposed rocks, and the boats sitting awkwardly on dry land. Questions began bubbling up. Was something wrong with the dam? Had there been a leak? Or was this just nature taking its course? Meanwhile, tensions between Alex and the HOA continued to rise. The president of the organization, a sharp-tongued woman with expensive suits and an air of superiority, seemed determined to paint Alex as a relic of the past. She dismissed his concerns during meetings, rolling her eyes whenever he spoke, up about preserving the community's character. Her condescending attitude only fueled Alex's resolve. Every snide remark she made about progress and modernization felt like a personal attack, pushing him further down the path he'd chosen. One particularly heated meeting stands out in Alex's memory. The topic of discussion was the Fehati upcoming grand opening of the $4 million resort. Posters advertising the event lined the walls of the community center, showcasing glossy photos of infinity pools, luxury suites, and private docks overlooking the lake. The president stood at the front of the room, gushing about how this development would put their little lakeside community on the map. "This is our chance to shine," she declared, gesturing dramatically toward the posters. "To attract visitors from all over the country, to bring prosperity to everyone here." Alex raised his hand, unable to stay silent any longer. When called upon, he stood up slowly, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "Prosperity for who?" he asked pointedly. "For the tourists who'll come here once and never return? Or for us, the people who actually live here? What happens when the lake dries up and your fancy resort has nothing to offer?" The room fell silent. The president blinked, caught off guard by the question. For a moment, it seemed like she didn't know how to respond. Then she laughed, a brittle, forced sound that echoed through the room. "Dry up?" she repeated, shaking her head dismissively. "Don't be ridiculous. That's impossible." Alex smiled faintly, keeping his expression neutral. "We'll see," he said simply before sitting back down. After the meeting, a few neighbors approached him, curious about his comments. Some agreed that the lake did seem lower than usual, while others brushed it off as paranoia. Either way, Alex could tell his words had planted seeds of doubt. People were starting to pay attention, even if they didn't fully understand what was happening yet. Back at home, Alex allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. Phase 1 of his plan was working. The water level in the lake was dropping steadily, though not so fast that anyone could pinpoint the cause. Soon, the truth would come out, and when it did, the HOA would have no choice but to face the consequences of their actions. But Alex knew he couldn't let his guard down. There was still work to be done, adjustments to make, and secrets to keep. The game wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just getting started. The chaos began subtly at first, like a slow leak in an old pipe. One morning, a neighbor walking her dog noticed that the water level near the shore seemed unusually low. She shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just a dry spell. But the next day, another resident spotted stranded boats sitting awkwardly on mudflats where there used to be deep water. By the end of the week, whispers were spreading through the community faster than wildfire. At first, people thought it was some kind of freak weather event, a drought or something natural. The HOA tried to downplay it too, issuing vague statements about seasonal fluctuations and promising to look into it. But as the days passed and the lake continued to shrink, panic started bubbling up. Boats lay tilted on their sides, docks jutted out into nothingness, and what had once been sparkling blue water now looked more like a muddy wasteland. It wasn't hard to see why tourists weren't rushing to book stays at the brand new resort anymore. And then came the moment when reality hit hardest. The grand opening of the $4 million resort was canceled. Alex watched all of this unfold from the sidelines, keeping his face carefully neutral. Inside, though, he felt a mix of emotion: satisfaction, guilt, and even a little sadness. He'd known his plan would cause disruption, but seeing the full scale of the fallout was sobering. Families who relied on tourism for income were losing business. Locals who loved the lake for its beauty and serenity were heartbroken. And yet, part of him couldn't help feeling vindicated. This was exactly what the HOA deserved after trampling over everyone's feelings and bulldozing The bridge without a second thought. The president of the HOA was livid. During an emergency meeting, called to address the crisis, she paced back and forth in front of the room, her expensive heels clicking angrily against the floor. Her usual polished demeanor was cracking under the pressure. "This is unacceptable," she snapped, pointing at photos of the shrinking lake projected onto a screen behind her. "We need answers, and we need them now." She launched into a tirade about possible causes, blaming everything from climate change to sabotage. Some residents nodded along uncertainly, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Alex sat quietly in the back of the room, pretending to take notes on a notepad. In truth, he was barely listening. His mind was focused on how smoothly his plan had worked so far and how much further it could go as the meeting dragged on. Tensions boiled over. One angry homeowner stood up and demanded to know why no one had checked the dam recently. Another chimed in, saying they'd heard rumors about old manual valves that might still exist but hadn't been touched in decades. The president dismissed these concerns with a wave of her hand, insisting that modern technology kept the dam functioning perfectly. That's when Alex decided to speak up. He raised his hand slowly, waiting until the president reluctantly acknowledged him. When she did, he stood up, his voice calm but firm. "I've lived here longer than most of you," he began, looking around the room. "And I can tell you one thing. This isn't normal. Lakes don't just disappear overnight unless something's wrong. Maybe it's time we stopped relying on assumptions and actually investigated." His words hung heavy in the air. For a moment, no one said anything. Then, almost as if on cue, several heads nodded in agreement. Even the president seemed momentarily speechless, her confidence shaken by the growing unease in the room. She quickly recovered, however, announcing that experts would be brought in immediately to inspect the dam, but Alex knew better. By the time those so-called experts arrived, it would already be too late. Over the next few days, things spiraled out of control for the HOA. The water level dropped lower and lower, exposing more of the muddy banks and leaving the resort looking ridiculous. Instead of luxury suites overlooking pristine waters, guests would have found themselves staring at cracked earth and stagnant puddles. Tourists canceled reservations en masse, and investors who had poured money into the project started pulling out. Rumors spread like wildfire online, with headlines calling the resort a disaster and accusing the HOA of incompetence. In the middle of all this chaos, Alex couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. He hadn't intended to hurt innocent people, just to teach the HOA a lesson. Watching families struggle because their livelihoods depended on tourism weighed heavily on him. Still, he reminded himself why he'd started this in the first place. The HOA had shown zero respect for the community's history or values. They'd torn down the bridge without consulting anyone, dismissing it as irrelevant. If they hadn't acted so recklessly, none of this would have happened. Despite the mounting pressure, the HOA refused to admit defeat. The president doubled down on her efforts to save face, organizing press conferences and issuing statements blaming everything from environmental factors to unknown third parties. Behind closed doors, though, cracks were beginning to show. Within the organization, members argued over who was responsible for the fiasco, pointing fingers and shifting blame. Morale plummeted and trust eroded. Meanwhile, Alex continued making subtle adjustments to the dam's valves, ensuring the water level stayed low enough to keep the resort unusable. Each night, he returned home feeling a strange mix of triumph and exhaustion. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever, but he also knew the HOA wouldn't give up easily. They were desperate to find a solution, throwing money at engineers and consultants in hopes of fixing the problem. One evening, as Alex sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he realized something important. He didn't want to stay hidden forever. Sure, he could continue manipulating the dam from the shadows, letting the HOA twist in the wind. But deep down, he wanted them to know exactly who was behind this. He wanted them to understand why he'd done it not out of malice, but out of love for the community they disrespected. It was time to reveal himself. The stage was set for a dramatic showdown. At the next town hall meeting, Alex walked in with purpose, his jaw clenched and his eyes locked on the president of the HOA. As she droned on about potential solutions to the lake crisis, he waited patiently for his turn to speak. When the floor opened for questions, he stood up, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "You destroyed my bridge," he said, addressing her directly. "You ignored the needs of real people in favor of your greedy schemes. Now you know what it feels like to lose something precious." Gasps rippled through the crowd as Alex admitted everything from discovering the forgotten valves to draining the lake bit by bit. He didn't mince words, laying bare the motivations behind his actions. Some residents were shocked, while others clapped in approval. The president of the HOA turned pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For the first time since the chaos began, the truth was out and there was no going back. The room was dead silent after Alex's confession. Every eye in the community center was fixed on him, some filled with shock, others with disbelief, and a surprising number with quiet admiration. For a moment, it felt like time stood still. The president of the HOA sat frozen at the front of the room, her face pale and her lips pressed into a thin line. She had spent weeks deflecting blame, accusing unknown forces of sabotage, and insisting that everything would be fine if they just threw enough money at the problem. But now, faced with the truth, she had no response. Alex didn't flinch. He stood tall, his hands steady at his sides, his voice unwavering as he continued. "You thought you could bulldoze over people's feelings," he said, addressing not just the president but the entire room. "You tore down something that meant so much to this community without even asking us what we wanted. You dismissed our history, our memories, like they were nothing. Well, I decided to remind you what it feels like to lose something important." His words hung heavy in the air. Some residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded along, murmuring their agreement. A few even clapped softly, though most stayed silent, processing what they'd just heard. It wasn't every day someone admitted to orchestrating such a bold act of defiance and doing it for the sake of the community. The president finally found her voice, though it cracked slightly as she spoke. "This is outrageous," she stammered, standing up to face Alex. "What you've done is illegal. You've caused millions of dollars in damage not just to the resort, but to everyone who depends on tourism here. Do you have any idea how many lives you've ruined?" Alex didn't back down. "I didn't ruin anything," he shot back, his tone firm but calm. "You did that yourself when you put greed ahead of the people who live here. This lake isn't yours to exploit, it belongs to all of us. And if draining it was the only way to make you see that, then I'd do it again." The tension in the room was palpable. For a moment, it seemed like things might escalate further, shouting matches, accusations, maybe even threats. But then an older man sitting near the front raised his hand. Everyone turned to look at him. He was one of the original residents of the lakeside community, someone who had lived there long before the HOA came into existence. His voice carried weight when he spoke. "He's right," the man said simply. "We've let them push us around for too long. They tore down Alex's bridge without a second thought, and now they're trying to turn our home into some fancy playground for rich tourists. Enough is enough." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. One by one, other residents began chiming in, sharing their frustrations about the HOA's decisions over the years. Someone mentioned how the new road widening project had destroyed a beloved walking trail. Another talked about how the flashy signs welcoming visitors felt out of place in such a quiet neighborhood. The floodgates had opened, and suddenly, everyone was speaking up, their voices united against the very organization that was supposed to represent them. For the first time in months, Alex felt a glimmer of hope. His plan may have been extreme, but it had achieved something remarkable. It had brought the community together. People who had once kept to themselves were now standing side by side, demanding accountability from the HOA. Even those who initially disagreed with Alex's methods couldn't deny the truth behind his message. As the meeting stretched on, the tide turned decisively against the HOA. When the president tried to defend herself, her arguments fell flat. Her promises to fix everything rang hollow in the face of mounting anger. By the end of the night, she resigned on the spot, storming out of the room with tears streaming down her face. Several other members of the HOA followed suit, leaving the organization in shambles. In the weeks that followed, the community came together to pick up the pieces. With the HOA disbanded, residents formed a new committee to oversee the area's future, one that prioritized collaboration and transparency. Plans for the $4 million resort were scrapped entirely, and the muddy shoreline slowly began to recover as water levels returned to normal. Engineers inspected the dam, ensuring it was safe and functional, while locals worked tirelessly to clean up the mess left behind. Through it all, Alex remained a central figure in the effort. Though some still questioned his methods, no one could deny the role he played in sparking change. He became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that sometimes drastic action is necessary to protect what truly matters. More importantly, he helped rebuild trust within the community, working alongside neighbors to restore not just the lake but also the bonds between them. One of the first projects they tackled was reconstructing the bridge. This time, everyone had a say in its design. It wasn't just Alex's creation anymore, it belonged to the entire community. When it was finally completed, the bridge was unveiled during a small ceremony attended by nearly everyone in town. As Alex stood beside his neighbors, watching children run across the sturdy wooden planks and families gathered to take photos, he felt a deep sense of peace. The battle had been hard fought, but it was worth it. The failed resort remained abandoned, its empty buildings serving as a stark reminder of what happens when greed overrides common sense. Over time, nature reclaimed a space, with grass growing through cracks in the pavement and birds nesting in the rafters. To Alex, it was poetic justice, a testament to the resilience of the land and the people who called it home. Life eventually returned to normal, or at least, a new kind of normal. The lakeside community wasn't perfect, but it was stronger than ever. Neighbors looked out for each other, decisions were made collectively, and progress was measured not in dollars but in happiness. And while being as for Alex, he returned to his quiet life on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the sun rise over the lake. He knew he'd never forget the chaos he'd unleashed or the lessons it taught him. Sometimes, fighting for what you love means taking risks, even ones that scare you. But in the end, it's always worth it. And so, the story came full circle. The lake was whole again, the bridge stood proud, and the community had found its voice. It wasn't just a victory for Alex, it was a victory for everyone.